Welcome to Christian Podcast, where we look at the world in our own lives through a Christian lens.
Great to be here.
Today's topic is Christian fatherhood in changing Singaporean society.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Singapore is so dynamic, isn't it? And you see these societal shifts impacting family life all the time.
Definitely. We'll be looking at how that enduring call to Christian fatherhood kind of navigates this whole modern landscape.
Exactly.
So we're diving deep into, well, quite a few sources today. We're drawing a lot from an article called The Transformative Role of Fathers in Singapore, a Christian Perspective in a Changing Society.
Right, and some others too, looking at, biblical principles, support systems, and the real everyday challenges Christian dads face.
Our mission, really, in this deep dive is to pull out the key insights from all this material for you.
Yeah, we want to help you understand the unique challenges, but also the opportunities for Christian fathers in Singapore right now.
And see how the Bible's wisdom, ancient wisdom, still speaks so powerfully today.
Absolutely. Okay, so where do we start? The sources really kick off with the biblical foundations, right?
They do. And it's presented as, well, much more than just bringing home the bacon, so to speak.
That's right. It's not just biology. The sources frame it as divine stewardship, a call to spiritual leadership in the family, fundamentally.
Okay, spiritual leadership. So how do the sources say the Bible defines that? What does it look like?
Well, a key principle they highlight is spiritual nurturing and guidance. You find it in Ephesians 6.4, urging fathers to bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord.
Right.
But importantly, it also warns against exasperating them, which sort of implies avoiding those really harsh authoritarian ways.
Not just laying down the law.
Exactly. And Deuteronomy 6.7 adds this layer of constant intentional effort.
Right.
Impress God's commands on your children all through the day when you're home, out, bedtime, waking up.
So it's an ongoing thing.
Totally. The sources really stress that this means Christian fathers need to go beyond just being the provider. They need to intentionally invest in their kids' spiritual formation.
How? Like practically?
Well, things like leading family devotions, praying together, maybe doing some community service as a family, actively shaping their faith journey.
Not just hoping they catch it somewhere else. That makes sense. What other principles do the sources bring out from Scripture?
There's also this idea of purposeful preparation. Psalm 127, verses 3-5, uses that really vivid picture, doesn't it? Children as arrows in the hands of a warrior.
Arrows, yeah. I like that imagery.
The sources see this as a call for fathers to, diligently prepare their children, equip them, aim them, in a sense, so they can go out into the world and make a positive impact for God's kingdom.
So preparing them for their own lives, their own calling.
Precisely. Intentionally shaping them for the future.
And of course, a huge part of leadership is just showing the way, right? Leading by example.
Exactly. And the sources point to biblical figures here, like Abraham, his faith, his obedience. Genesis 18.15 mentions God knowing Abraham will direct his children to keep the way of the Lord. And Joseph, too, modeling integrity under, immense pressure. These examples show how vital it is to live out your faith authentically.
So kids see it lived out.
Yeah, teaching moral values, building that legacy of faith. Proverbs 1.8 directly tells children to listen to your father's instruction. It underscores that role as teacher and guide.
It really emphasizes how active this role is meant to be. But what about the style of leadership? How should it be done?
Okay, this is crucial. The idea of servant leadership, it comes straight from Jesus' example, washing the disciples' feet in John 13. Totally radical, redefining leadership as service, not power.
Right, turning leadership on its head.
Completely. And the sources argue really strongly that this means Christian fathers should reject those sort of authoritarian or top-down approaches at home.
So what instead?
Instead, it's about humility. Really listening, actively listening to your wife and kids, showing empathy, sharing decisions when it's appropriate. And what's interesting is how the sources connect this specifically to Singapore's context. Multicultural, diverse family structures. This servant-hearted approach is seen as really vital there.
That makes sense. Adapting to the reality of different family setups, not just one traditional model.
Exactly. It's a posture of humility, of service. And finally, the sources touch on partnership and responsibility.
Partnership.
Yeah, drawing from ideas like in Genesis 1.27 about male and female partnership. It suggests a model of shared responsibility in the family.
So bringing it all together.
Bringing it all together, the Christian father is called to be, well, multifaceted. A spiritual leader discipling his kids, a servant-hearted provider who makes sacrifices, and a cultural influencer guiding the family through modern life.
Wow. That's a deep, spiritual, very relational and active role. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at the actual stage where this plays out, Singapore's changing family landscape. The sources talk about some really big shifts.
Oh, they do. The basic family dynamic are definitely evolving. You see more and more dual-income households, which, naturally puts more pressure on everyone's time,
Yeah.
workplace demands.
Right. Less time, more pressure.
And the average household size has actually shrunk quite a bit. It's around 3.09 people now.
So smaller families.
Smaller families, yeah. And often less of that built-in intergenerational support, like grandparents living right there to help out.
So that traditional village, it might be further away now for many.
It might be, yeah. But there's this really interesting counter-trend the sources point out, a significant rise in stay-at-home fathers.
Really? Stay-at-home dads.
Yeah, the numbers apparently doubled since 2011, something like 14,100 men. It's still a minority, obviously, but it's a big jump.
Wow, that's surprising. What does that signal?
Well, the sources suggest it signals a growing cultural recognition that, hey, parenting is shared.
Yeah.
And it highlights the potential and maybe the need for dads to be really deeply involved day to day.
That's fascinating. And is the government keeping pace? Are policies reflecting this?
It seems so, yes. The sources mention specific government policies supporting more father involvement, things like extending paternity leave. It's up to 4 weeks now.
4 weeks, okay.
And shared parental leave options, too. Plus, there's this explicit shared parenting initiative from the government pushing the idea of equal responsibility.
So policy is moving towards encouraging dads to be more involved, but, policies are one thing, culture is another. What about societal expectations and cultural shifts?
Yeah. This is where you see some real friction. Those societal expectations, the workplace culture, they can still be huge barriers for dads wanting to be more hands-on.
How so?
Well, many fathers still feel this immense pressure, prioritize the career, work the long hours, and the sources say this can lead to that emotional distance from the kids. If the culture quietly says your main value is your paycheck.
It makes it hard to choose family time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. It's a real conflict.
Totally. And there was this 2023 survey mentioned only half of Singaporean students felt their parents showed interest in their schoolwork.
Only half. Wow.
Yeah. Now, it covers both parents, but the sources suggest this might point to a gap, maybe especially in paternal engagement, given those traditional roles and work pressures.
And the sources also talk about broader cultural values shifting.
Yes, they highlight this tension. Singapore puts a massive emphasis on meritocracy, individual talent, hard work driving success, and individualism. Great for the economy, right?
Right. It's driven a lot of success.
But the downside sometimes is that it can kind of sideline or de-emphasize those traditional family-centric values. Shared time, community, intergenerational bonds, things central to the biblical view.
It's like success gets defined in very individual career terms.
Exactly. And then you have other pressures mentioned. Consumerism, that pull of individualism, the massive influence of digital media on values and attention, cultural relativism, this idea of no absolute truth, making it hard to ground kids in faith.
That's a lot to navigate.
And don't forget, Singapore's pluralistic society, increasingly diverse family structures, blended families, single parents. It just adds layers of complexity for fathers.
Okay, so we've got this timeless biblical call leader, servant, nurturer, and then this super complex, fast-changing Singaporean context. So the really interesting part, how do these collide? Where's the friction? Where maybe do they actually line up?
Right, this intersection is key. The sources show both significant tensions and some actually quite promising opportunities.
Let's tackle the tensions first. What are the main clashes?
Well, a big one is that direct clash we mentioned. Singapore's focus on meritocracy and individualism versus biblical ideas of community, sacrifice, intergenerational ties. That relentless drive for individual achievement makes it tough to prioritize the time, the energy, the sacrifice needed for intentional family building and discipleship.
The me versus we tension, almost. Achieve for myself or invest in my family.
You could put it that way, yeah. And those societal pressures, consumerism, individualism, the digital noise, they constantly fight against the biblical call to prioritize focused family time, real community involvement.
It's a battle for time and attention.
Definitely. The sources are quite clear. Heavy workplace demands. The career focus, they often conflict sharply with that biblical mandate for fathers to be present, intentional investors in their kids' lives. It directly feeds into that emotional distance problem.
Man, it really underscores the need for some countercultural choices, doesn't it? Rooted in faith. You said there were also alignments, opportunities.
Yes, absolutely. It's not all doom and gloom. Some shifts actually align well with biblical principles and open doors for Christian fathers.
Like what?
Well, take that growing cultural acceptance of shared parenting, the rise of stay-at-home dads. These trends actually resonate strongly with the biblical call for dads to be meaningfully, actively engaged, moving beyond old stereotypes.
So society is, in a way, catching up to the biblical ideal of the involved father.
In some ways, yes. And importantly, those government policies, paternity leave, shared leave, they're not just symbolic. They give fathers actual time and space to be more involved. It makes living out that biblical mandate more practical.
That's a tangible alignment.
And that shared parenting initiative from the government, it lines up quite nicely with the biblical ideal of partnership, like we see in Genesis 1.27, a cooperative approach.
And you mentioned PM Lee's emphasis on family. How does that fit in?
Yeah, the sources see this as really important for engagement. When the country's leader highlights family as a cornerstone of society, it gives Christians a platform.
A common ground.
Exactly. A common ground to talk with leaders, advocate for policies that strengthen families in ways that align with biblical values. Use that shared language of family importance.
That makes sense. Using that common ground strategically. Okay, so considering this whole complex picture, what's the specific practical call for Christian fathers in Singapore today, according to these sources?
Right. Building on all that, the sources lay out this clear threefold mission. It's rooted firmly in Scripture, but tailored for this specific Singaporean context.
Okay, what's the first part of that mission?
First is to really embrace spiritual mentorship. That's saying, again, decisively, move beyond just being the provider. Intentionally invest in your kids' spiritual formation through regular, real practices.
Like the devotions and prayer you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Leading family devotions, praying with them, getting them involved in serving others. The sources even mention local examples like the Dads for Life movement, which equips dads for this very thing, directly tying into that Deuteronomy 6.7 idea.
Being the main spiritual guide. Intentional. Consistent. Got it. What's number 2?
Second is to practice servant leadership right there in the home, consciously applying those biblical principles. Humility, active listening, empathy, sharing decisions.
And adapting it.
Yes, adapting it. The sources stress how vital this is with Singapore's diverse family structures. They give an example of Benoit Riviere, a father in a blended family, who models this inclusive love, this intentional connection with all his kids. It shows how servant leadership works in real, sometimes complex, situations.
That example makes it very concrete, applying that humble, loving leadership in a modern family. Okay, and the third call.
Third is cultural engagement. The call isn't to hide from cultural shifts, but to engage thoughtfully. Discern what's happening with gender roles, materialism, technology.
Engage, not just react or retreat.
Precisely. Engage while holding firm to biblical truth at home. It means making active choices, prioritizing family time, community involvement as a deliberate pushback against pressures that devalue family and faith.
Engaging culture, knowing the influences, but anchoring the family in truth. Wow, that is a demanding call. It sounds like support would be absolutely crucial. What practical steps, what support structures do the sources highlight?
Yeah, support is key. The sources are really clear that Christian communities, especially local churches, are vital. They're seen as essential hubs for equipping men.
Equipping how?
Through things like fatherhood workshops, parenting with purpose, seminars, places that offer both biblical grounding and practical tools for today's challenges.
So the church as an equipping center, not just a Sunday stop.
Exactly. Things like dads and kids camps, run by groups like the Anglican Church, are mentioned too, creating dedicated space for bonding, shared activity, shared faith journey. It builds that sense of community among dads. You're not alone in this.
That community aspect sounds incredibly important.
For sure. And movements like Dads for Life, supported by the Center for Fathering, play a big role too. Resources, events, encouraging those weekly faith conversations. It directly supports that spiritual mentorship piece. And there are nonprofits too, like the Good Daddy Center, offering workshops, events, really focused on training and empowering dads for active engagement.
It's good to know there are these dedicated groups.
Yeah, and Christian schools often play a part. Anglican High School is mentioned for integrating biblical teaching into their parenting programs. And the sources also really emphasize intergenerational discipleship.
Passing faith and wisdom down the generations.
Exactly, through formal mentoring or just organically in church life, or involving kids in service alongside older mentors. They mentioned the Singapore Christian Community Services Grandfather-Grandchild program is a great example.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it embodies that Proverbs 17.6 idea, the glory of grandchildren, actively creating ways for wisdom to be passed down.
That intergenerational connection is so powerful. Okay, so community support, specific programs. What about influencing the bigger picture?
Good point. The sources also strongly push for policy and advocacy, encouraging Christian fathers to get involved, advocate for family-friendly policies, more flexible work, affordable childcare, mental health resources for family.
Don't just shape the system to be more supportive.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Engaging leaders, using those biblical values to influence systemic change, and leveraging PM Lee's emphasis on family as that common ground for advocacy. Supporting things like the government's shared parenting program is another practical way to align with policies reflecting biblical partnership.
So it's a really holistic approach, strengthening dads within the church, using programs, fostering connections across generations, and working to shape the environment through advocacy.
Exactly. But, despite all this support, the sources are realistic. They acknowledge the ongoing challenges. Individualism, work pressures, cultural relativism are still very real.
It's not easy.
Not at all. But they end on a strong note of hope. Hope grounded in the resilience of Singapore's Christian community, in the innovative ways they're equipping fathers.
So, tough challenges, but real hope and active efforts.
Definitely. The ultimate call, as the sources frame it, is for Christian fathers in Singapore to see themselves as agents of renewal, helping rebuild families rooted in God's love, shaping future generations marked by faith, resilience, love. That Psalm 127 image, again, aiming those arrows well.
Wow. This deep dive has really shone a light on the profound, complex, and vital role of Christian fathers in Singapore today, balancing timeless truths with a rapidly changing world.
Yeah, we've covered the biblical foundations, the Singaporean context, those tensions and alignments, and the crucial support systems out there.
So considering this call to spiritual leadership and all the pressures of modern life we've talked about, here's something maybe to reflect on. How might you intentionally integrate faith formation into your daily family life?
That's the ongoing challenge, isn't it, for all of us?
Thank you for listening. See you next time.